Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Adam.
Usually this is behind the scene for Uncertain Things, which you're now welcome to.
Welcome behind the curtain.
We usually record our introduction 7 months after recording the interview.
After we've gotten our shit together enough to put it together, yes.
By which point we mostly forgot what the interview was about. So we're kind of winging it, hoping that our introduction in some way captures any verisimilitude of the actual interview. And you'll have to tell us whether that actually works or not, because we never listen to our interviews. But this time we realized that we can be professional. We can actually record the introduction immediately after the interview. So you're witnessing the next stage of Uncertain Things.
I don't know if it was that we realized we could be professional. I think something about our conversation with Yascha was like, let's debrief this immediately.
Right.
Which is ironic because we came into it incredibly not energized. So tribute to Yascha for pepping us up for this.
Yes, Vanessa suffers from the germ of the COVIDs.
I have come down with the COVIDs.
And Adam suffers from the germ of greed and real estate development.
Oh, I was going to say overindulging in alcohol, but sure, that too.
Well, today we have Yascha Mounk, who is a political theorist and writer for The Atlantic, who's
author of the new book, The Great Experiment.
Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. So, if you're into Uncertain Things and the stuff that we talk about, you should definitely read it. It's almost like a compendium to David French's Divided We Fall, in thinking about what is the social science of diversity in democracies and where it could lead to total destruction and dissolution of unity and state, and where it could be actually propped up for growth, prosperity, variety of colors and flavors and ideas.
Actually, you're making me think we should have an Uncertain Things bookshelf or something where people can, because this is one among the books, I think also Martin Gurry's book, Revolt of the Public, that are just so uncertain thingsy. And I feel like people should, if you don't read all of the books of our guests, which, shame on you, but if you don't, you should at least pick up these three and have conversations about these three, because they're very uncertain things of the moment. Timely, as we tell Yascha.
Right. Timely and podly.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it requires a lot of introduction, because we do get into the meat of it very quickly. But the question that we're trying to get at is, what is the type of diversity that we're even talking about? And to what extent does a democracy that is liberal, which means it promises to guarantee the freedom of its individual members, can actually tolerate group divisions, whether those groups are divided by nationality, ethnicity, race? How much can a state that is focused on the rights of individual can accommodate the differences of these groups to sustain themselves, to maintain their identity, but also to interact with each other in a way that does not lead to civil war, basically.
Not just small groups. I mean, because a lot of what Yasha's talking about is applicable to the United States today, in which we're talking about kind of broader partisan divides within the country too. So it is like minority majority, but it doesn't have to necessarily be within small ethnic groups.
First of all, the whole problem of trying to strike a line between left and right sometimes gets incredibly difficult, because partisan people make a lot of noises, and then it's so difficult to actually get at what are we even arguing about anymore. And Yascha makes a very specific and strong point that challenges the reactionary elements on the right, the anti-diversity, what he calls the roll back the clock people on the right, the Sohrab Ahmaris that are hoping to use politics to establish cultural hegemony in the United States, but also challenging the, let's call it radical fragmentation tendencies on the left, on the intellectual left, where identity becomes the sole point of focus. which he also points out could be pernicious to liberal democracies, whether in the form of fragmentation or entrenched blood feuds or even anarchy.
By the way, I really liked the way you opened that statement. You said partisan people make a lot of noises. I feel like if there were a compendium of poetry to accompany the Great Experiment, that would be the title. Maybe spoken word. But yeah, no, I think we get into that pretty quickly with Yascha. It's really fascinating the way that his study of political systems throughout history and the lessons learned and how we can apply those to the United States today. And this question of ossification of identity is a really interesting one that we talk about a lot in the American context, which I think is pretty fascinating. One part of our conversation that I also found quite interesting was we started to dive into the kind of Hispanic question and why Hispanics are a great example of the way that left elites think about race and politics and how they intersect just totally doesn't map onto reality. And I'm excited to talk about this more with our next guest, which is Angel Eduardo. And I think we're going to have a really continued fascinating conversation on that.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm looking forward to.
Good point. We also talked with Yascha about whether there's a danger of political association becoming its own form of divisionist identity. And for the last about quarter of our conversation, I basically did the unthinkable and tried to push back against Yascha's defense of liberal democracy. You know, that thing of which I'm usually the booster of boosters. So that's fun. Here's to the cognitive dissonance. So we are Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com. And
wait, one more shout out before we get to Yascha, though. We have an Uncertain Things listener that we have to shout out because she literally recognized Adam by his voice in a New York City establishment and said, "Are you Adam of Uncertain Things?"
And asked my friend who was not Vanessa. She was my one friend who's not Vanessa. Are you Vanessa? And
I wasn't, but
and it wasn't.
Could have been. It could have been me.
So totally shout out to you.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for being a supporter.
So we are uncertain.substack.com. If you want to support us, share us with your friends and enemies. And if you really, really want to support us, you can drop the schmeckles on the Substack. We also have the Inscrutable newsletter. It's a section in our Substack. You can go in and sign up for that as well if you want to experience us through the written word. And aside from that, here we go.
Yascha Mounk.
Yascha, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So let's just, dive right in. Your new book, The Great Experiment, is, I don't know, I hate the word timely, but it's so fucking timely because
it's very timely.
Very timely. It's just something that I think we've been kind of talking around on our pod for a while, and you did you actually did the work to
the hard work
of making this argument that we were trying to explore better. So let's first kind of do some ground setting.
Yeah.
The subhead of your book is why diverse democracies fall apart and how they can endure. So let's start with the foundational question. What do we mean by diverse democracies? What kind of diversity? And why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. So, look, every society thinks of itself as diverse in certain kinds of ways, right? So today in the United States, the difference between Catholics and Protestants is not particularly salient. We don't think about it that much. We don't worry that there's going to be some deep conflict between Catholics and Protestants breaking out tomorrow. But that was very different for much of the history of Europe. That's different today still in Ireland and Northern Ireland, right? So there's all kinds of different fault lines between different groups that societies have had. But we've also seen throughout history that some of the most powerful fault lines, some of the things that have led to violent conflict, to civil war, to genocide most often, is deep religious and deep ethnic differences, right? So when somebody has a completely different religion from you, when somebody looks in a salient way different from you, clearly comes from a different cultural group, those have historically been the moments when society has often gone very wrong in dangerous ways. And so what the great experiment is, what is unique about our situation, is to try to build democracies that are much more ethnically and religiously diverse than any others that have treated their citizens equally. So what we've had in the past is lots of pretty homogeneous societies and democracies. Germany, where I grew up, at the moment of the founding of its post-war democracy, had become very homogeneous because of the Holocaust, because of the expulsions of the first half of the 20th century, because of all of that bloodshed. The United States has always been diverse, of course, but was, at the moment of its founding, deeply unjust in a way that made it easier to run the country, because you're saying, hey, those of us who have something to say are all part of the same group, and the other people we're just excluding and dominating and enslaving and doing terrible things to. Today, we have a new and unprecedented situation, which is trying to build these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies in a way that actually treats all of the members equally. And that's the challenge that I sort of try to figure out.
So I think it's worth just spending one more second on this question, because it's worth understanding a point that you're making in your early chapters, which is basically that humans can generate differences around the most arbitrary lines. Any sort of category, essentially. Humans are just naturally predisposed to find differences and then develop group identity and loyalty around those differences, which also means hostility towards people who are different from you. That is just part of the human condition. That means that even in a group that you think is homogenous, over time, under very simple circumstances, can start fracturing along even the most random lines of difference and distinction. And the reason I think this matters is because there's this point that I often make about America's culture war, that so much of it seems silly and symbolic. Like, really? Is Drag Queen Story Hour the catalyst for a second civil war? But the point is that we seek differences, and it doesn't matter how stupid they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I tell this really fascinating story of a psychologist called Henry Teifel in the book. Now, Teifel, was born just after World War One in a small town in Poland. He was born to a Jewish family, was not able to study in Poland because of a quota on the number of Jews who were allowed admission to universities at the time. So he enrolled at the Sorbonne to study chemistry. And then within a year or two of him starting university, World War II broke up, and he volunteered for the French army as a soldier. He survived the war as a prisoner of war. So he was treated as a French prisoner of war rather than a Jew because of the Geneva Convention. Most of his family was killed. And after the war, he thought, well, I really want to figure out, what is it about groups that makes people do these terrible things? Why is it that people are willing to discriminate against outsiders in favor of the in-group in these extreme ways when this group psychology is activated? And there's a lot of research around that in the 50s and 60s, famous things like the Robbers Cave experiment, the Milgram experiment. But Teifel was saying, well, this all shows that groups are powerful. It doesn't show what makes groups powerful. Right? So here's how I'm going to go about to study this. It was a really interesting thought. He said, look, I'm going to create groups that are so silly and so pointless that their members are not possibly going to discriminate against outsiders. And then I'm going to keep adding little features to those groups to understand what is it that makes groups powerful. At what point do they cross the threshold from silly groups that don't really motivate their members to groups that make people behave in these discriminatory ways? And so he got a bunch of kids from the suburbs of Bristol into the lab, and he showed them just a sort of scatter plot, a sheet of paper with, say, 150 dots on them. And he had them estimate and guess how many dots there are. And so some said 120 and some said 180. He said, great, I'm going to put you into the underestimators and the overestimators, and then you'll have to play games where you can win prizes, some cash. And it turns out that the members of the underestimators immediately discriminated against the members of the overestimators in this group, and vice versa. So his attempt to create a group that is so silly that its members wouldn't discriminate against each other failed. Right? It's called the minimum group paradigm. We are incredibly prone to forming groups, and the moment we formed groups, we're going to favor those who are members of them.
Is the reverse also true, I guess, in that if it's incredibly easy for human beings to slip into group mentality, is it very difficult for us to revert out of group mentality?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to revert out of group mentality. But what is relatively easy is to redraw the boundaries of groups. So let me tell you a second story. So there's a great study about Southeastern Africa. So this researcher goes to Malawi, and he talks to these two tribes there, to the Chewas and the Tumbukas. And he asks the Chewas, what do you think of the Tumbukas? And the Chewas have all these prejudices against Tumbukas. They're saying, the Tumbukas, the wedding dances are wrong, and the married couples, they go and live with a bride's family. That's really bizarre. They should live with a groom's family. And so he says, well, would you ever vote for a member of a Tumbuka tribe for political office? Would you ever marry one of them? He said, no, of course not. What are you talking about? He goes to the Tumbukas, and they have just the same prejudices. It's exactly the same thing in reverse. Their dances are all wrong. They go to live with a groom's family. That's crazy. They should live with a bride's family, etc. So he could afford. This is, as journalists like to say at the time of the civil war in Yugoslavia, an ancient hatred. These people have just always hated each other. They're always going to hate each other. That's just what they're like, nothing to be done, right? But instead, he went across the border to Zambia. And this is an arbitrarily drawn colonial border, like so many of them, just on a map, He's like 10 miles away. It's really a very similar place. No salient differences. And he goes to a Chawa village and he asks them about Tumbukas. He says, yeah, they have different customs, that marriage dances are different and so on. But no, I like them. I said, oh, really? So would you marry a member of a Tumbuka tribe? Would you vote for one of them? Oh, yeah, sure, no problem. And he goes to a Tumbuka village in Zambia. Same story. They're really positive about Chawas. It's like, what explains this? Why? This is the name of the article. Why are they allies in Malawi and the enemies in Zambia? It doesn't make any sense. Well, the answer is politics. So Malawi is a pretty small country, and Chawas and Tumbukas together make up the lion's share of the population. And so they both can hope to win the presidency, and they're competing against each other. And they have politicians saying, these Tumbukas, they're terrible, don't trust them, they're our enemies, right? In Zambia, it's a bigger country, and the share of the overall population of these two tribes is much smaller. And so they're political allies. And so their politicians are saying, hey, yeah, the Tumbukas, they're a little different from us, but hey, we should hold together because the tribes from Western Zambia, they're really different. We don't want them to win, right? So, we're always going to be members of groups. Where we draw the boundaries between those groups and when that allows us to think of each other as allies and when that allows us to work together, that really depends on the kind of social and political conditions we're going to put in place. And so for me, one of the really important things is how do we structure American society today in such a way that we don't get what we often talk about, but we don't get this fundamental clash between whites and people of color or between different kind of demographic groups. Because it would be easy for that to happen, but that would be a real disaster. So the question is, how do we set up our politics, our culture, our education, our other institutions in such a way that we encourage cooperation rather than conflict?
So maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but one of the the fundamental conclusion from this study, if I remember correctly, by Daniel Posner, his name, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Is essentially that the possibility of political power capture is the thing that motivates or foments hostility, right? And cultural resentments. It's the necessary condition to develop the race for obtaining naked power. So my question is that something that you can even hope to overcome at scale? Because the larger the scale we're dealing with, like say 300 million people in the United States, the more likely we are to see the emergence of new factions with their own competing but deep political ambitions.
So you'll always have power competition. You'll always have Democrats disliking Republicans and Republicans disliking Democrats. The question is, do these political line of conflicts also align neatly with all the other lines of conflicts we have in society? And particularly, does the conflict between Democrats and Republicans align with a conflict between whites and so-called people of color?
So it's a convergence between political power and other forms of identity.
So we're always going to have political competition. That's always going to make people say, hey, I like the people in my team better, right? The question is, if we have all these different lines of conflict in society, that's easier to manage, right? So it used to be the case 50 years ago, for example, that I might be a Democrat, you might be a Republican, and that made us a little skeptical of each other. But we were perhaps also, as at that time most Americans were, members of the same mainline church, right? So we're also members of the Methodist church or whatever, right? So it's like, well, Bob over there, I mean, he votes for Republicans, which is kind of a little weird. But you know what? We go to church together and we're on a committee together at church and, our kids play together and so we get along, right? Nowadays, the problem in American life often is that, we live in different places, we have different educational backgrounds, we have different racial backgrounds, and we vote for different parties. And so then I say, hey, Bob is just different from me in every respect, and he's evil. I don't share anything with him. He just hates me and hates what I want for in this country. And so I do think that for that reason, when electoral competition is carried out along ethnic or racial lines, it becomes particularly dangerous.
One of the things that I find quite interesting about the book's premise is you're essentially asking, how do we make diverse democracies that are successful, that don't fail, right? But that premise has an underlying assumption, which is that diverse democracies are good in what we want. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just unpacking that assumption, because it feels intuitive. It feels intuitive, like, yeah, of course we want a diverse democracy. Who doesn't like diversity and democracy? Those are two words that go together quite well. But you could make the counter argument, I suppose, that actually, no, we should go back to different forms in which it was more homogenous or splinter or something. So would you mind just kind of justifying why that is the central premise that you're building your book upon?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And in a way, I'm not making an argument for diverse democracies, which is to say that there's some countries in the world today that have pretty homogeneous democracies. And it's up for them to decide whether they want to keep that, right? So I think Japan and Bulgaria can make democratic decisions legitimately about how much immigration they want. Now, if they don't want any immigration, that has some very serious disadvantages. They're both depopulating countries, and that presents real economic and social challenges. But if they say we'd rather depopulate than have a lot of newcomers come here, and we value our cultural homogeneity, I'm not, I don't think it's my place to tell voters in Japan or voters in Bulgaria how to live. That's fine. They can make their choice. The majority of democracies in the world today, and certainly the biggest, the most influential, the most populous democracies in the world, already are highly diverse. That is true of countries like Brazil, it's true of countries like India, it's true of countries like Nigeria, and it is obviously true of the major countries in Western Europe and North America. It's obviously true of the United States. So for us, we don't get to ask that abstract question because that boat has sailed, right? And so for us, the question is, do we want to go back to being more homogeneous or go back to having some form of racial domination? Or do we want to make our diversity work? And there the answer is very, very obvious. The only way to make America a more ethnically homogeneous country would be extreme forms of violence and conflict and civil war and genocide. I've studied enough of the history of diverse societies to know that that is a possibility. That might happen. It's happened before. It just would be a very terrible outcome. We could go back to saying, hey, some parts of the population just aren't treated equally at all, and they're subordinated, and the majority gets to tell them whatever they want. That might happen. That would be a deeply unjust outcome that I obviously find horrifying. And so for most democracies in the world, the predicament is just such that we got to make the diversity work if we want to have peaceful societies, if we don't want to fall apart in dramatic ways. So in that sense, I don't think of it as an argument for diversity in the abstract. I think of it as an argument for how can societies and democracies that already are deeply diverse actually succeed. And that is the case for most democracies in the world today.
So let's talk about the potential paths for failure of diverse democracies, which you enumerate. I think you list broadly 3 types. So I'd like to let you set this up, and then I have a few questions. So what are the 3 main collapse paths for diverse democracies?
So you want me to set this up and walk into your trap, and then you'll have some mean questions. No, that sounds great.
Adam's ready to pounce.
Yeah, I can picture him.
He's eager.
So look, one form of failure, one mode of failure, is simply that the competition between different ethnic or religious groups is so strong, so extreme, that they can't agree on building a state together. So that has historically been the case in places with weak states like Somalia, like Afghanistan. where there's all of these different clans and tribes and groups, and they say, hang on a second, if we build a state together and you capture power, that might end really badly for me, so let's not do that. And you pay a really heavy price for that, because if you don't have a state that is functional, then first of all, you have endemic forms of civil war for most of your history. And then secondly, you don't manage to build roads, you don't have a public health system, you don't have good education. So you have really bad outcomes for the people living there, including shorter life expectancies and so on. Now, one kind of solution to this is for one group to capture power and impose its might on the others. It's forms of soft or more often hard domination, in which one group is in charge and says, well, the other groups just have to do what we tell them. One of the most extreme examples of that is slavery in the United States, right? So it's whites saying, hey, we're going to tell this minority what to do, and we're going to make them work for our benefit, for our own purposes. So that's obviously a deeply unjust solution. It solves some of the problems of what's called structured anarchy, because actually those states often end up being relatively affluent. They're able to maintain a system of public order. They're able to build roads and all of those things, but at the unacceptable price of treating one group in a deeply unjust and inhumane manner. And so then there's a kind of third solution, which has been historically embraced by countries like Lebanon, which I would call, so the first is called structured anarchy, and the second is called domination, and the third is called fragmentation. And that's to say, look, we have a state, and we've had historically fights over who gets to be in charge of it, but those end up being really existential, because each group really wants to be in charge, and we have these very well-defined groups in society. So what we should do is to have the state be a little bit of a shell. I mean, a lot of the most important decisions are governed at the level of a group. So in Lebanon, the three most important groups are Shias, Sunnis, and Maronite Christians. And we're saying, all right, look, the Speaker of the House is always going to be a Maronite Christian, the President is always going to be a Shia, and the Prime Minister is always going to be a Sunni. I may have gotten this a little bit wrong. And your laws for marriage, for divorce, for education, for all of those important personal things actually are governed at the level of the group you're a part of. If you're a Shia, you're subject to these kinds of laws. If you're a Maronite Christian, you're subject to those kinds of laws. The problem with
that's the one inspired by the Dutch precedent, right? From the era of decolonization.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of, it pre-exists the example, but then this political scientist, Arend Leipart, sort of seizes on it and says, this should be the model, and then it's exported to a bunch of other countries.
By the way, as a political theorist, can you, I know it's going to be a difficult question, but can you pronounce the name of that theory?
Oh, consociationalism.
And no chance I can repeat this.
Yeah, well done. Well done.
I had a moment of trepidation.
Nice.
But Leipart is a great example for why I don't buy this theory, because it has all kinds of injustices. So I have two friends from Lebanon, like this guy that I met at summer school years ago, and then suddenly I see his picture in the pages of The Guardian. I think, hey, what's he doing? He's marrying this beautiful woman. What's going on? And why is there a story about him in The Guardian? Well, the answer is that they're both Lebanese, they met in New York, but they're from different groups. And they wanted their wedding to be respected in Lebanon, and the state would not register it because it just does not have provisions for members of different groups to marry each other. Because to sustain this scheme, you gotta have people stay members of their own groups. What law is supposed to govern you if you're members of different groups, and it's the groups that define the law of marriage and divorce and all of those kinds of things.
So
right?
if domination basically enforces one perspective on everyone else, the problem with fragmentation is that it ossifies group into their culture and traditions and doesn't allow for cross-cultural interaction and cross-pollination.
Exactly. So it doesn't allow me to say, hey, I actually want to go and spend time with or marry somebody from a different group. It doesn't give me democratic control over the laws I'm subject to, because there's a national parliament, but there's not a Sunni parliament and a Shia parliament. So if I want to change the law of divorce because it's unjust to women, for example, I don't really have a way of doing that. But the deepest problem is that Leipart publishes his theory saying, this is the solution to these deeply divided societies. This is how we keep the peace. This is how we avoid civil war. And 3 years later, Lebanon starts a really bloody and protracted civil war. So because it doubles down on these identities over time, it doesn't actually deliver on its most fundamental promise, which is to avoid civil war.
Right. And I guess it also kind of inhibits evolution, right? You're going to be less likely to evolve, change, come up with new ideas that will gather more political support because you're always going to have your fixed base that's going to stay the same.
Exactly. So Leibniz comes from benevolence, and in benevolence, you used to have what's called a system of pillars, of pillarization. So life really was very strongly determined by whether you were Catholic, Protestant, or liberal. Those were sort of the 3 main pillars. Everything from which newspaper you read, which school you went to, what hospital you'd be treated in was informally organized around those pillars. But because it had a much less strong system of consociationalism, because it allowed people to evolve, today that is not so important in benevolence, right? It's not the defining thing for you, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or liberal. And so that allows society to evolve and for that conflict to become less strong. And I think that's an important thing to think about in our context in the United States, which is that obviously some social conflicts do run along ethnic and religious lines. And obviously we want to make sure, for example, that we help minority groups overcome some of the injustices that they've historically suffered. But we don't want to do it in such a way that it just sets in stone these lines of division and makes them stronger and stronger and makes us completely incapable of overcoming them over time.
So to sum up, we have the danger of essentially cultural authoritarianism. We have the danger of anarchy, and we have the danger of being in a frozen form of cultural stasis, where cross-pollination is not allowed, or there's no political space for it. And those are the scenarios that we are essentially afraid of if we don't find a new language or a new political approach for sustaining diversity and democracy.
That's right. Are you ready to pounce?
Not yet. My challenge is still around the corner. The thing is that I come from, I'm comfortable just so publicly agreeing with a guest, but I was raised in Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem we experienced the cultural status quoism between secular and religious authority, and I always found that to be I've never had the word for it, but I think your concept of political fragmentation is exactly what it is. It's set in stone politically, a separation between secular culture, religious culture, and different religions as well, while also, I guess, defining certain hierarchical differences between them. And the fact that part of the political system, part of the political language of sustaining order in Jerusalem relied on these very rigid categories didn't allow for fluidity and dynamism between the groups. And in Jerusalem, it's far less paradigmatic version of this problem than Lebanon. But this is my own experience. So I know this is something that often gets ignored in talking about political diversity.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that example, but from the relatively little I know about Israel, that makes perfect sense.
It's especially even Jerusalem. It's a sub.
Right.
I mean, because
Tel Aviv is a whole different world.
And if you look at Israel broadly politically, obviously it has a form of domination in a very literal sense. So it's like it brings all the problems of diversity. Mm-hmm. There's just one piece I think that we didn't address, which is also important both in the Jerusalem status quoism and generally, because we point out that the problem with fragmentation isn't just that it ossifies groups into their identity, at least as far as the political structure is concerned, but also that it gives cover for corruption.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so that's what you see very strongly in Lebanon, right? That because the only way that you can run the society is basically as having these pretty immobile blocks that aren't very dynamic, that don't change very much, that are represented by the elites from within each block. And so and Leibniz says this very clearly. He says, look, ideally, the average Shia and the average Sunni and the average Maronite Christian never really talk to each other, never really have any kind of exchange. But then their leaders should be able to sit at a table together and hash things out and build up trust with each other because they're sort of, in parliament together and they're negotiating together, and they sort of get along. Now, A, that's a pretty horrible vision for what a society looks like in general, but B, that obviously breeds corruption, because that means, hey, here's the 10 leaders of the different groups sitting together, hashing things out, and one easy way to agree on is you get $1 million, I get $1 million, that guy over there gets $1 million, and all of the people we represent get screwed. So I think it's really a natural result of this. And when you look at things like the terrible explosion in the harbor of Beirut and the deep ossification of Lebanon's political system, it's connected to this supposed fix to the divisions in their society.
So kind of drawing parallels, I guess, to the United States, it seems to me that we might potentially be on this track towards that third trap that you were talking about, this kind of ossifying identities, particularly when you think about what you said earlier about our politics and our culture dangerously aligning into ways that might ossify groups' identities and lead us into division. I mean, is that how you would diagnose what's happening in the US right now?
Yeah, so I think we have forms of each of these dangers today. So I think, the idea that we have structured anarchy might seem far-fetched because we have a very functional state, we have a giant military, we have a big federal budget. But we see, for example, from studies from around the world that the more salient ethnic and religious diversity we have, the harder it is to sustain a welfare state. So in some countries, as diversity has increased, people have started to support welfare state spending less. And that's certainly a challenge in the United States, where we might say, well, why should we pay for child benefits if, those kinds of people, in quotation mark, are going to get the benefit, not my kind of people. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is certainly there are still some forms of domination that structure our reality, and there are some people who would like to double down on them, to reintroduce some of them. So we certainly have to make sure that we don't end up excluding groups, and that's a hard challenge. But I agree with you that perhaps the most obvious and salient challenge is this third one. Is one where we say, hey, you are so defined by the group you're a member of, and the institutions of society encourage you to think of yourself to such an extent as white or black or Asian American or Latino, that we sort of split society into these 4 or 5 rival tribes, but have some uneasy peace between them that gets harder and harder to sustain with every single year. And I think that there are some developments, especially frankly, among the American elite, frankly, among people, often in my kinds of circles, university professors and people at think tanks and foundations and so on, who are really increasing that danger. So one example for this is when I think about what's now the case in many elite private schools in the United States, at Citadel Friends in DC, at Dalton and Horace Mann in New York City, where there's going to be a teacher coming into the classroom at the age of 10 or 8 or 6 and telling kids, hey, the most important thing about you is your skin color, and now we're going to split you into groups of African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans and whites and talk to you about injustices in the country and so on. And it's good to raise consciousness about injustices. It's good to talk honestly about the state of our society. But when you do it in such a way that you're from the top down communicating to children, the most important thing about you is the color of your skin, and that's how you should organize. It's not likely that we're going to build more solidarity. It's likely that we're going to activate all of those in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination mechanisms that we've been talking about at the beginning of our conversation. And that's especially true for whites. So there's now good emerging data that when you tell white people how privileged they are and how much they're defined by their race and how much they should give up those advantages, they actually become more discriminatory, not less discriminatory. And so the idea that something's good going to come from taking these 10-year-old kids and trying to raise in them the consciousness of a white identity and turning them into committed anti-racists in that kind of way, I think is just very short-sighted and very naive, and does really run the danger of fragmenting our society in this way. Now, I will also say something else, which is that at the same time, when I look at what our society actually looks like in the breadth of it, away from these political developments, away from what I think is the misguided pedagogy in some schools, it's really positive. When I was born, a majority of Americans, and I'm 39, a majority of Americans, a clear majority of Americans, still thought that interracial marriage is immoral. You used to have about 1 in 33 kids being mixed race. Today, the number of Americans who think that interracial marriage is immoral is down in the single digits, and you have about 1 in 7, 1 in 6 kids who are interracial, so or who are mixed race. So actually, there are lots more friendships, lots more relationships, lots more business partnerships, lots more contacts being created between different ethnic groups in the United States every day. When I look at what's going on in the heart of society, I don't see that fragmentation. I actually see a process of defragmentation. But I worry about the way in which our political conflicts and the ideas of some influential people in America might actually push us back towards a kind of polarization.
And what do you think about my more abstract concern that the culture warism, which can, derive a lot of its energy from racial, ethnic, or even gendered concerns, but ultimately revolves around political identities, can lead to the degree of fragmentation that we're seeing in more hyper hostile and fractured nations?
Yeah, so one way that I'm thinking about reality at the moment is that we have a kind of cultural civil war of the elites. And one of the questions, but actually a lot of the trends in the last decades in the heart of American society have been positive. People are much more tolerant than they were. There's actually much more integration at the grassroots
But tolerant of what? You see the tolerance, you mentioned some degree of progress around race, some degree of progress around accepting immigrants. But can you say the same thing about your political group or tribe? Because if you look at the statistics, you find a lot more tolerance of intermarriage between different races and different nationalities and different religions than between different political parties.
Yeah, that's true. There's some interesting studies on that. So just to finish my basic model, I think this is cultural civil war of the elites. And then the question is whether they're going to manage to impose that on the rest of society. Now, I think that's also somewhat true in politics. When you look at the policy preferences of ordinary citizens, they're actually pretty sensible, and they're not moderate in the sense of always being in the middle of politics, but this is quite sensible. Like a lot of Americans want much tougher gun regulation. A lot of Americans want more of a welfare state on certain key issues. A lot of Americans would want a child benefit, for example. But a lot of Americans also reject the idea that we should defund the police, or that we shouldn't make sure that we're capable of actually punishing criminals. So I agree. But one point on which I'm quite conservative is that I agree with this old idea that I'd rather be ruled by the first 100 people in the Cambridge telephone book than the assembled Harvard faculty members. So apologies to my many friends who are on the Harvard faculty. And I think if you want to be a small D Democrat, you have to believe that. If you actually want to believe in democracy, you got to believe,
as opposed to an aristocracy,
a majority of Americans. Yeah, but a majority of Americans are actually capable of responding to decent moral reasons, but they're decent people. Now, having said all of that, it is true that there is a deep political polarization that is much less strong among ordinary people than among elites, but that has affected all of society. And there's two really starting facts about that. The first is that in the 1960s, Americans didn't care whether their child would marry a spouse of a different political party, but they certainly did care if a child wanted to marry a spouse of a different race. And in some parts of America, of course, they were still illegal in the 1960s. Today, that is reversed. So people are much more likely to dislike the idea of a child marrying the out party than marrying somebody of a different race.
Yes.
And there's also another really interesting study where they had these people in the lab choose scholarships for students, right? And so they could give out 2 scholarships of 5 students or whatever, right? And they manipulated the CVs a little bit. And so there's 2 ways in which they manipulated them. One indicated a political leaning. So the kid was the president of a high school Democrat club or a high school Republican club. And one indicated the GPA, right? Just as a matter of objective or more or less objective merit. And then the third was by race. So there was some marker which clearly indicated whether somebody was white or black. And it turns out that there was a little bit of in-group discrimination on ethnic lines, not very much at all. Among Democrats, I believe there was none at all, or perhaps even out-group discrimination on that particular metric. But there's very strong partisan identification. So, whites were not significantly less likely to give a scholarship to a black kid, but Democrats were way less likely to give a scholarship to somebody who's Republican, and vice versa.
It's interesting when you were giving your example of earlier of the teachers separating the students to teach them about, race and anti-racism. I was actually kind of surprised that you were marketing the divisions in our country along racial lines and like giving that as an example of the ways that we're dividing races. Because for me, I thought you were going to say that the division is much more along cultural and political lines, like elite coastals or urbanites, if you will, and like non-urbanites and more conservatives. And for me, that example of the school is potentially more applicable to that division because you have. I'm imagining that the teachers, the educational systems are part of these urban elites that are enforcing kind of their racial ideologies into the educational system to create children that are thinking in these ways. And if you're going to get any pushback, it's from families who don't necessarily ascribe to those political, cultural alignments. And then you're going to get more of this settling out where those people are potentially going to leave the cities and go to other places, maybe smaller cities or more suburban places where they won't have to deal with that.
Or to Florida.
Or right to Florida, to where they don't have to deal with those kinds of institutional values being pushed on their children. So I'm just curious if you kind of agree with me that it potentially could align to that fragmentation as well.
Look, here's an example which may seem unconnected, but I think really is making the same point. I read a report a couple of days ago, yet another report about why on earth are Hispanics all voting for the Republican Party now? I mean, they're not all voting for the Republican Party. Most still vote for the Democratic Party.
Media really don't get Hispanics. They really don't
understand. It's incredible.
It's
just nuts. And so what does the report say? This is like funded by the big Democratic players and sort of, this is like a key part of the Democratic Party's attempt to like stop them from voting for Donald Trump in 2024, which, if you ask me, is a pretty important cause. And what do they say? Well, they've just all fallen for racialized misinformation, which basically is saying they're just racist and dumb. We have to authentically engage with them, even as it's referring to them as Latinx. Now, if you want to authentically engage with Latinos, and I know this point has been made a million times, it's kind of boring, start by not calling them something that 98% of Hispanics in the country dislike, which is the term Latinx, right? But it's just this idea that like Hispanics should be people of color, and think of themselves in these terms. If they're not, then it must be that they're sort of idiots and they're misunderstanding something. It's just that is not how Hispanics think of themselves. Their political interests, first of all, are that of most Americans. They want to earn more money and not pay too much, for gas and housing and so on, and they just want to have a good life. That's the most important thing. You see that in all of the polls. And then there's really complicated racial politics within the very, very diverse groups of Hispanics. There was this really sort of slightly odd, I found it horribly racializing, but also interesting Pew study where, Pew asked Hispanic respondents to rate themselves on a color gradient of how white or black they are.
Goodness.
And there's like a little like chart with like the 10 different
the
like,
hands,
the
colored
and, like,
hands.
different brands.
Yeah, that was great.
But it turns out that by far and
goodness.
away the most common response was the second most white one.
Wow.
Right. So most Hispanics think of themselves as pretty white, and there are deep divisions, deep discrimination within the Hispanic community against native Latin Americans, for example, and so on. So this idea that you can look at this, huge group of Hispanics and just, they're all people of color who naturally share interests with these other completely different people we're also calling people of color. And that means we're always going to vote for the Democratic Party. It's just really nuts. And so, to speak to what you're saying, Vanessa, that is something that, among the American elite is a really strong ideology that we can divide America into whites and people of color, and that explains a lot. And by the way, that's something that a lot of my friends and acquaintances who are more on the left think. It's also what Tucker Carlson thinks in a different kind of way, right? He's threatened by that, and my friends think that that's going to be wonderful for the country. They both actually share the same underlying belief. A lot of ordinary Americans don't. They don't want to think about the country that way. And so, I agree that this is something that's taught at Dalton and Horace Mann and Sidwell Friends. It's not actually how most Americans think of themselves. And I think it's good when most Americans don't think of themselves that way. Because if they did, we'd be in a lot more trouble.
From the Republican side, the whole gerrymandering arms race comes from their own subscribing into the idea that, democracy's destiny and that they're basically bound to be extinct by 2030 or something. And therefore, if they don't lock in control right now, they're doomed.
Yeah, so this is what I call the most dangerous idea in American politics. Look, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives basically agree on nothing today. And you'd think I'd be heartened that they can agree on anything. But sadly, the one really big theory about America that they agree on is both empirically wrong and belief in it is really dangerous and misleading. And that is this idea that demography is destiny, as you were saying, and that 30 years from now, the Democrats will have this emerging, or as it's increasingly called, inevitable political majority. Now, this drives the right nuts and crazy, right? So when you look at Michael Anton, really influential essayist who later became a senior advisor in the Trump White House in 2016, he's saying, the problem today is the, I quote, ceaseless importation of third world foreigners, end quote, who hate the Republic and they hate the Republican Party, and they're going to doom us. And so that's why we should put Trump in charge, because Trump may not know how to run the country and it may mess everything up. But unless we stop this right now, our chances are doomed forever anyway, right? So that's demographic panic on the right. But then you have demographic.
That's the Flight 93 election argument, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's in that essay. It's really fascinating essay. I recommend everybody read it, not because it's pleasant or because I agree with it, but because it really shows you a mindset.
And I'll just add that the part of the mindset is not just the impending doom. It's also kind of set the trend for the past elections, where if we lose this election, this is it for us. It's an existential crisis.
It's the last time we have a chance of winning the elections, because afterwards the demographic forces will be even more arrayed.
This may be the final election, which is by a rhetorical game that Democrats have adopted as well.
Well, on the demographic, so they sort of worry that the next election may no longer be fair, right? Which I mean, there's I think some more reason to worry about. But then on the Democratic side, on the demographic question, there's this triumphalism, right? So there's all these articles in NPR and Vox and so on in 2016 saying Hillary Clinton can't possibly not lose because there's now enough people of color that just mathematically we're always going to win. And by the way, by 2045, the country's going to be majority minority, and all these minorities are voting for us. So by that time, we're definitely going to win. Now, that's also dangerous because it makes Democrats deeply complacent, right? That's what's saying, hey, Hispanics should be voting for us. So why are they not? Must be misinformation. I mean, this reminds me, I haven't thought about this before, just thought about this a second. This reminds me of increasingly desperate attempts by Marxists in the beginning of the 20th century to explain why we haven't had socialist revolution everywhere yet. Right? It's there must be some even more complicated mechanism by which these inevitable forces of history are being thwarted. There are no inevitable mechanisms of history. So if you believe that we just have to wait and mobilize the right people and victory is going to fall into our lap, that's dangerous. That allows the other side to win.
Right.
But it's also just a really dystopian vision of what the future might look like. I don't want to live in an America in 2045 where I can walk down the street and guess who somebody's voting for by the color of their skin. Well, this assumes that I would then vote for a Republican Party. I don't want to vote for a Republican Party. And even if that means that Democrats win every election, and that might be good, it still means that 47% of the population is going to be whites who are disenfranchised at every election, who lose every election. And who have a lot of guns and who have a lot of power. So this is not a positive vision for what this country would look like that anybody should want. Now, thankfully, it's not actually reflecting reality. And the 2020 election was really interesting in that regard. Because the only reason why Donald Trump was competitive in the 2020 election is that he very significantly boosted his share of the vote among every non-white voter groups, among African Americans, among Asian Americans, particularly among Latinos. And the only reason why Joe Biden is the legitimately elected 46th president of the United States is that he significantly increased the share of the vote among white voters relative to Hillary Clinton 4 years ago.
But you've touched on the scary thing. When I mentioned Democrats are also adopting some of that rhetoric, they've adopted this, I think, even before the current push on the Republican side to truly rig the election in a true sense, John Eastman style. But the point is that there is a constant gerrymandering arms race that partly originates in the demography's destiny approach, but is becoming separate to it and is becoming just focused on politics. And that terrifies me because you can see how it really is a process of constant escalation on both sides.
Yeah, and so what's really interesting about the gerrymandering is that for a long time, gerrymandering gave Republicans a real advantage, in part because they were a little bit more ruthless about it, in part just because they had more power at the state level, so they were more able to be ruthless. Now, because this gerrymandering cycle is really influenced by the 2018 electoral results, and they were very positive for Democrats, and because I think Democrats are becoming more ruthless, they've sort of countersteered. And so at this point, gerrymandering does not give a systemic advantage to either Democrats or Republicans in the upcoming election, according to a whole host of analyses.
Right.
So this is a lot of people who've really studied this in detail, all agreeing on this. So you could think, hey, it's not a problem. In the past, they gave one party an advantage, and now it doesn't. It's still a huge problem because, first of all, it's just absurd when you look at the shapes of these districts where, they make you laugh or cry. Secondly, it robs people of real choice because it means that the vast majority of Americans live in really uncompetitive districts, and the legislators are choosing their own voters rather than us choosing our legislators. But thirdly, it is pushing our politics to the extremes because instead of elections being decided in the general election in a tight competition between two different political parties, they are decided in hyper-partisan primaries in which the winner of that primary is virtually certain to go on to win the general election. And that is a real problem. So yes, thankfully, it's good that we no longer have a partisan lean, but for American politics, that's still a really deep problem.
Right, which means but about the primary, obviously the result is that the most crazy voice that appeals to the base is the one that's going to win, because the people who go and vote in primaries aren't the general public or not even the general voters of certain parties, but the people who really have the political motivation to go and vote for their representative, which usually would go for the crazier, more partisan voice.
Adam, I was going to ask if you wanted to switch you to your question that you want to ask, because I don't want you to forget it.
Yes. So you make a strong case for liberal democracy, which is a subject that we often get to on this podcast. But you start with articulating exactly what you think the role of a state should be. You argue there that, especially given the context of diversity, that the role of a liberal democratic state should be to facilitate essentially the freedom of conscience, which is, to think, feel, believe, express, and fuck whoever and whatever you want. And it's the state's role to protect the individual from having their rights infringed upon by the state itself. That is, by people in power. But then you also add a very, revealing argument that this is insufficient in itself. It's not merely a libertarian formulation of protection, but also a state needs to be protecting the individual from the potential oppression of its own group. If a group has certain practices that are restrictive, that limit an individual's freedom to maybe exit the group, like Jewish Orthodox Society, or if the community enforces certain violent practices on the individual that they can't opt out from, then the liberal state should be responsible to intervene and prevent that. This is where I had my question, because you also make a part of your argument for where we should be putting our energies politically and culturally is finding a shared purpose as a country, a shared identity, things that unite us, find shared goals, shared meaning. But for a lot of people, as you point out yourself, their shared meaning are derived from their groups, from their cultures, their communities, whether they're religious, ethnic, or separate nationalities. The problem is, what if for a lot of people, those shared nationalities are defined around forms of oppression? What if oppression, to some extent, is the secret sauce of having group purpose and a shared meaning? Because one of the complaints or criticisms of a liberal democracy is overemphasizing liberty and the freedom of a person to define themselves, is that it loses the substance of identity. If everything goes, then nothing matters. you can find your shared meaning around baseball or around other generic voluntary associations, but then you lose the glue that actually makes people feel committed and meaningful and purposeful in their group. So that's my challenge.
That's a great question. Yeah. So, look, so there's a communitarian criticism of liberalism, which is somewhat similar to yours, but I think it's different in an important respect, because I think your question is much more honest. So the communitarian criticism of liberalism often is to say, look, you liberals like to talk as though we were all just choosing your own menu of life. As though the decision whether to honor your parents or the decision whether to worship is the same as my decision tonight after this interview whether to order pizza or sushi from DoorDash. And that's just not how people live, right? They are born into these networks of people who they have deep obligations to. They are born, they're raised to believe that they have these deep diktats of conscience towards their religious group. And so this is why this individualist liberal notion of how to run a state, which just rights and obligations of individuals, really doesn't work. And you guys just don't respect groups. You don't respect religion. You don't respect those kind of kinship networks. That's the problem of liberalism, right? So that's a sort of classical argument here. And so
it would also kind of not respect maybe like working class or lower class folks that don't have the ability to access that level of choice.
Right, there's also a question of like how much choice do you have? How much actual substantive choice do you have? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so the answer to that is twofold. It's to say, well, look, no, we don't expect everybody to completely change their conception of life once they turn 18. We know that most people are going to continue to be in touch with their families and to have obligations towards them and to feel that that's something that they didn't really choose, that is just part of how they grew up and how their life is always going to go. We know that most people have religious beliefs that match that of their parents and are at least to some extent going to remain members of those religious communities. And that all is fine. In fact, it is precisely the most fundamental liberal values which make sure in a diverse society that all of us can live up to those. Because you might have one set of obligations and I might have another set of obligations, only because we have the freedom of worship and the freedom of association and those basic liberal rights, but we're each going to be able to live those out. So liberals aren't opposed to groups, they're not opposed to religion. In fact, it is precisely our recognition of the centrality of them which accounts for the way we specify the basic rights of the individual, which are strongly to do with that. But, and here's my objection to that kind of communitarian conception, it's my more direct response to Adam's question, there are also going to be some people who want to leave the society they're in, or the group they're in. There are going to be some people who say, hey, my parents say I have all these obligations to them, but actually they were abusive. They treated me terribly. I don't like the way they live, and I want to go no contact with them. I want to go and lead my own life, right? There's going to be some people who say, hey, I was raised in a religion which says that sex before marriage is a sin, and I'm supposed to consult my parents on who I'm going to marry. But you know what? I'm 20 years old and I'm fallen in love and I want to go and date this person. I want to have sex with them, and I don't want to be afraid that my parents are going to beat me up or send me to conversion therapy or murder me or do all kinds of other terrible things that actually do happen in our society from time to time, right? And so at that point, my answer is just, yeah, you have a clash of values, right? You have a vision of society which says tradition and groups and religion is so important that they should be allowed to force people to remain members of them. That's because really important things are at stake. Going to heaven rather than hell is at stake. Then there's another conception which says, look, I'm sorry, but one of the obligations of the state is not just to protect groups and individuals from the state and from a tyrannical majority. It's also to protect members of those groups against their own group when it becomes necessary. It's also to say you can escape what Dara Acemoglu and James Robinson call the cage of norms. You are able to leave your own group if you so choose. Most people won't. But if you choose to leave your own group in that kind of way, we got to make sure that you're able to do that.
Right, but this is where we get into conflict, or I think into the worthy discussion is the cage of norms essential? So you're saying offer a way to opt out. The state should facilitate opting out. And I was involved in Jerusalem in many groups that that tried to create a path for people to exit the Orthodox society if they were gay or if they were women who wanted to escape their husbands. I know how difficult it is to create those facilities, and sometimes you actually need to secure their physical safety because their community might actually try to come after them. But where do you draw this line? Because first of all, just giving the right to exit a group is already difficult and obscure enough, but let's accept it at face value. But what about circumcision or female genital mutilation? Are those things that the state should be involved in? Where do you draw the line of what's acceptable in group oppression and what isn't?
Yeah, so let's first of all start with this. So what are the two different models here, right? So one model is, hey, groups should be able to oppress, or they should be able to actually tell the members what to do.
Without which I argue the group doesn't really exist as a group. And to say that you can derive meaning from that group just on the abstract of, and I don't know that I fully believe that, but I'm leaning hard into this argument just to see your reactions.
Yeah.
But my point is that if you give up on all the norms and just follow the abstract of an ideal identity, then you're no longer, Jewish, you're Reform, which is basically Christian Protestant.
Okay, so let me say two things about this. So the first is, look, I just believe that at that point the group is no longer worthwhile. I think that there are many groups that have deep meaning around the world, but that one of the preconditions of being sufficiently just that we should pay you respect is that you don't coerce your members. And actually, America is a society in which people have great individual freedom and can go and do whatever they want. And yet there's a thriving Orthodox Jewish community. I actually currently live in one in Midwood. I mean, there's Orthodox Jews all around where I am in Midwood. They all have the right to go, 5 steps on the Q train and go to a nightclub, and they don't. So I just don't think empirically that it is true that in a society that gives people those rights, fake groups with fake obligations on their members are doomed to cease existing. Actually, I think America has historically been great for these kinds of groups. And then B, when you think about how to make a diverse society work, I just don't think it's going to work if you don't give people that individual freedom. Because then groups are going to start to say, we're going to impose our views on everybody else, and that's going to be a real disaster. Now, there's going to be hard cases, right? And so, I think there's a sort of idea in philosophy sometimes. It's an interesting methodological point about philosophy, if your listeners will indulge my political theorizing for a second, where people think, look, if you have the right conception of the world, then there shouldn't be any hard cases, right? Like once you have the right principles about some question, then it should just always be obvious what you should do in the world because the principles tell you what to do. And that's not actually the case. The right principles should point to the competing considerations. But there's still going to be hard cases where you say, hey, this is like so much in the middle where like from one value we hold, we should do X, but from the other value we hold, we should do Y. And the standard is, do our principles explain in the right way how to maneuver that kind of situation? So female genital mutilation and circumcision are really difficult cases because especially in the case of circumcision, it is historically a marker of a belonging in a community. It is a religious duty, but it does also alter the body of young children in a way that's unchangeable and irreparable and that they don't choose, right? So for me here, the question is there a compelling interest of a child in being able to make that decision themselves? And I think a lot of the question of that goes back to whether this infringes with a sexual liberty in a very significant way. We give children braces, we do all kinds of permanent aesthetic alterations to them that they can't undo. As long as there's no compelling interest at stake, that's perfectly fine. That falls into the realm of decisions parents can make for their children. When you talk about forms of female genital mutilation, which make it hard to orgasm, which make it hard to enjoy a sexual life, that is obviously unacceptable. For me, the question of circumcision turns in part on the empirical question of whether it actually very significantly reduces the sexual pleasure that a male child is going to be able to experience later in life. There's some people who make the argument that it does. I haven't looked into it deeply enough. I'm a little skeptical of that argument. But I think that's what it'll in part turn on. But absolutely, in the case of female genital mutilation, yeah, I'm sorry. I know this is a traditional custom in many communities. It's a deeply ingrained custom. It's something that people feel passionately about. It's not easy to tell people you're going to go to jail if you do this to a child. But I'm sorry, that is not something that you get to do to a baby. And it's one of the obligations of a state to make sure that girls do not have their own decisions in life curtailed in this extreme way.
Your point about the Orthodox communities in Jersey, I think, still belies the argument a little bit, because if you're, I know a number of people who exited from New York area Orthodox communities, and they are, that was a very difficult process because there was still a lot of cultural coercion. They weren't just able to go on a subway at will, because the impact of psychological coercion is ingrained and profound. You don't need to constantly threaten to burn people's apartments down to know what the cost of either ostracism or even just, the risk to your soul might be by leaving. So is that kind of coercion legitimate or not? That's question one, and I'm going to just cram in another one because we're coming close to your leaving time. And my second question is, so you're basically admitting, I assume, or acknowledging that part of...
I haven't admitted anything. I may have acknowledged it, but I haven't admitted anything.
You may or may not have acknowledged that it is within the purview, or even maybe the duty of a liberal society to some extent dilute the power of the community, or at least to soften its edges.
Well, to make sure that it's not oppressive, to make sure that it doesn't violate the rights of its members.
And to the extent that this harms the integrity of the group, it is still necessary to be done to sustain a true liberal society.
Yes, but I think there's lots of very, very thick groups in our societies that don't coerce their members in those kinds of ways, and then we should respect. So I don't think that we should have a general preference for, if you want to distinguish between thinner and thicker groups. I think, lots of people live within very thick groups. And that's great. That's wonderful, as long as they're doing that in a voluntary way. I don't think we should be worried about that. That can be...
But not all groups necessarily deserve the dignity of a liberal democracy.
No. I mean, if a group is... let's take an imaginary extreme example. If a group is sacrificing every fifth child on an altar and, doing all kinds of horrible things to the members of them and beating anybody who criticizes its leader up and so on, then they shouldn't have respect. No. So the only precondition for your group to enjoy respect in our society is that you accord other groups the same respect that you want to be accorded. It doesn't mean you have to love them or you have to think they're wonderful. It just means that you allow them to coexist, and that you don't coerce your members, that you're able to attract members who are willing to remain part of it of their own free accord, or to join it of their own free accord. So those are the two basic preconditions. So you had what was the first question you had?
Just that there's still psychological coercion.
Oh, now, leaving a group is always going to be hard. And you can think about what forms of psychological coercion are legitimate, what forms of psychological coercion are not legitimate. But, the fact that it's going to be hard, the fact that, your parents may no longer want to talk to you, that is a hard reality that we probably can't get around. Parents don't have a duty to talk to their child. And if they think that the child that doesn't follow them, their religious beliefs, is not worthy of being talked to, I find that tragic and terrible. But that's not something the state can do something about. What the state can ensure is that you get the education to make meaningful choices. You have, to Vanessa's question earlier, the socioeconomic preconditions, that if you're cast out by your community, you're not immediately thrown into abject poverty. And you don't have to worry about physical coercion or other threats to your direct well-being. That's still going to give communities all kinds of ways to keep many of their members part of it, because they don't want to disappoint their parents, because they're used to living in a particular community, because it's scary to change your style of life. And even though I feel for the people who that impacts, that's fine. That's part of what it is to grow up in some community. But what we can make sure is to ensure that you have to get enough secular education that you can go and be an independent citizen in the world. You have the material preconditions to have a social safety net if you want to really change your society. And you're not afraid about goons turning up at your doorstep and beating you up.
Okay, so I just my follow-up to this is just you tell the story of how you've shifted from being raised as from a family of Holocaust survivors in Germany and somebody who believes very much in the international vision of humanity and very cynical about nationalism and patriotism. And I think that was a common sentiment among young Germans at the time, which makes sense considering the history. Having seen the darkest form that nationalism can take. But you would describe how you've turned into somebody who is a little more open to the importance of patriotic feelings in order to sustain a healthy, vibrant democracy. So what I was wondering as I read this, your acceptance of some form of civic as opposed to ethnic patriotism and maybe nationalism, is your acceptance or tepid embrace of this necessity, is it accepting the human condition, accepting that these feelings are essential to the human experience? Or do you see it as a more utilitarian concession? As in, right now, societies still need that sort of tacky glue in order to sustain democratic cohesion, but ultimately it's just a stepping stone to the ultimate universal humanist vision that you once held. In other words, are you fully converted, or are you more like the conversos of Spain, still secretly holding on to their Jewish beliefs?
I would make the distinction between what political theory is called ideal and non-ideal theory. So ideal theory is sort of, in a world of angels in which we could have everybody, always being motivated by the best possible thing. Would we have something like patriotism? Perhaps not. I'm not sure. But we live in non-ideal theory, right? We live in a world in which people have a psychological makeup that they do. And part of its psychological makeup is to really be drawn to groups. And in a deeply ethnically and religiously diverse society, for me, this means we're always going to have those communities you just talked about, Adam. I really don't think that because we give people the liberty to leave their groups, suddenly there's no longer going to be any Jews, there's no longer going to be any Christians, and there's no longer going to be any Amish. That just isn't what the world seems to look like. People have these really strong group identities. But precisely because of that, we then also need something that goes above that. We also need something that allows people to say, hey, I might be a Hispanic guy living in LA, and you might be a Black Muslim woman living in Michigan, and this person might be a WASP living in Vermont. But actually, we're rooting for the same team in the Olympics. Actually, we are capable of sustaining a welfare state together. Actually, we're willing to defend our country together, as we're seeing millions of patriotic Ukrainians do bravely on the news every day at the moment. And so that's why, as a German Jew, patriotism did not come naturally to me, but I have started to embrace the notion of patriotism. One that rejects ethnic ties as the foundation of our patriotic sentiment, but says that it's obviously not limited to just having the same ethnicity. That's not what makes it meaningful. One that is based on civic patriotism, on the Constitution and our common civic values, but that also has a strong cultural element that recognizes that actually a lot of Americans who say they love their country do so because they love its sights and smells and sounds, its landscapes, its cities, its ways of doing things, its cultural scripts, its celebrities, its TikTok stars. And that is actually a dynamic, naturally diverse culture which is looking towards the future rather than the past. And we shouldn't be afraid of embracing that.
So, Yascha, I want to ask you for our last question, something we try to ask all of our guests when we can think about it in time. What do you think are the biggest blind spots on the left and the right?
Well, I think ironically, the biggest blind spot is actually the same on the left and the right at the moment, which is to say that the right has become deeply pessimistic about the state of a great experiment, about the state of our diverse societies, saying, for example, that all of these immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador and so on aren't integrating, aren't succeeding, they're somehow inferior and all of that kind of stuff. Now, the left rejects that attribution of blame, but it actually is similarly pessimistic about the state of our society. It might say that all these immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador can't succeed in the way that Italian and Irish Americans did 100 years ago, because our society is so racist, so discriminatory, that they never have a chance. Now, there is racism, there is discrimination in our society, there's lots of problems, but actually the best studies show that immigrants from those countries today are rising the socioeconomic ranks, are succeeding at about the same speed as Italian and Irish Americans did 100 years ago. And so I think that a lot of people have a starting point when thinking about diverse democracies, where they say it should be really easy, but look at all the problems we have, so we're terrible and we should now become pessimistic. The movement of my book is the other way around. I think once you look at this topic in detail, you realize that it is really hard. It's really hard to make this stuff work. But actually, by comparison to how hard it is, we're doing really well. We've made real progress. And purely politically, we're only going to manage to convince people to embrace this diverse democracies, to embrace the project of what my book calls the Great Experiment, if we have an optimistic vision of a kind of society we could all live together in to offer. And so that's what I try to do.
Yascha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for indulging us in our devil advocacy, by the way.
No, that's great. No, I really enjoyed that. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media when we are on social media, which is infrequent, but you can share us with your friends and enemies, which will be a great support. Thank you, and until next time, stay sane.